It always feels dangerous to say it's been a quiet week in diplomacy, but this week the silence has been deafening. After the fanfare of the summits in Alaska and Washington, D.C., expectations that a summit between Presidents Putin and Zelensky could be imminent have plummeted. And Donald Trump's new 2-week deadline for Russia to make further concessions or to face massive sanctions is a threat that many have heard before. An interview in the Western media by the Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov highlighted just how far apart Moscow and Kyiv still are on issues from territory to security guarantees.
The Ukrainians and the Europeans who attended the meeting in Washington, they try to distort what was discussed in Anchorage between President Trump and President Putin regarding, in particular, the security guarantees. Why should we be swallowing all this? I explained to you, I never said that Russia must have a veto on security guarantees, but security guarantees must be subject to consensus.
But it was yet another major attack on the Ukrainian capital, Kyiv, that's led to numerous fatalities and damage to both the EU mission and the British Council, which has drawn the loudest condemnation. So, as American patience continues to be tested, will Trump's latest ultimatum ring hollow, or could it actually help to bring the conflict towards some kind of conclusion? Well, to answer all of your questions, we're joined by our expert panel.
I'm Vitaly Shevchenko.
I'm James Waterhouse.
I'm Olga Robinson.
And I'm Jamie Coomarasamy. Welcome to Ukrainecast.
Ukrainecast from BBC News.
Now, it's been a familiar theme over the past several months, and we are now once again waiting to see whether the latest American deadline on diplomatic progress can bear fruit. And with that in mind, let's get straight to our first question this week. It's from Robin in Torquay, who says, why are EU-UK leaders not picking up the phone to Putin to lead on diplomatic efforts to end this war? Whether we like Putin and his regime or not, he has made it abundantly clear that he believes that Russia's security requires a buffer between Russia and NATO. Whatever doubts we may have about Russia, it cannot be doubted that we know exactly what Russia is looking for to achieve a long-term peaceful resolution. Why does the EU and the UK think that Ukraine can win back all of their lost territory, even with EU and UK support? This is not a question of appeasement, but recognising reality and stopping thousands more people being killed just to prove a point. Western Europe is too close to Russia to leave it to the US to lead on this, when US policy changes every day, if they have a policy at all. Vitaly.
Well, it's not that they haven't tried talking to Putin, European leaders, and Ukrainian presidents as well. Almost 25 years of trying to engage with Vladimir Putin before they realized that the point of talking to somebody who lies, who doesn't keep his word, is becoming vanishingly small. Agreements reached with Russia guaranteeing Ukraine's security, recognizing Ukraine's borders, agreements reached with the West on weapons reduction, agreements on various ceasefires, agreements not to attack were all broken by Vladimir Putin. And this stuff about a buffer that he allegedly requires, that's a lie too. What about the Baltic states and Finland? They're right next on Russia's border. They're member states. And yet, how often do we hear from the Kremlin about the grave threat coming from those countries? It just isn't. At one point, after Finland joined NATO in 2023, Vladimir Putin said, no, we're not worried about Finland and NATO at all. Let them. In the year 2000, he said, actually, Russia might join NATO. That was right after it came to power in Russia. So I'm not buying this line about Ukraine and NATO being a threat to Russia. Ukraine's accession to NATO was a very, very distant prospect back then. It's still very distant. It's an excuse.
James, the proximity of Western Europe to the war. I mean, again, drawn into focus by these attacks we've seen in Kyiv, on the EU mission, the British Council, those buildings damaged. But what about the back channel discussions? Are they going on?
I agree. Like this attack in Kyiv is sinister in nature and timing, not least after a relative lull after the Putin-Trump summit in Alaska. I don't think it's a fair argument. I understand the argument about Ukraine's European neighbours being there and having to think about doing the doing when it comes to propping Ukraine up and keeping it secure in the future. But I don't think Europe or Ukraine thinks it can liberate its territory. They've had to be clear about that. There's also been a shift in tone on Europe going its own way and, say, getting on the phone directly to Putin. You know, as the months have gone on with Donald Trump, there has been increased dialogue, cooperation in some areas, and there's also been an acceptance that they simply can't do it. They can't provide the necessary military means to stop Russia from rearing up its aggression in the long term, which is why they are having to exercise this diplomatic discipline. They are following Donald Trump's lead. I've just sat at an online European Union briefing where we were hoping to get some details on peace talks, the Zelensky-Putin summit perhaps, what America means by its involvement in security guarantees. And the short answer is they don't yet know.
One of the most common subjects our listeners get in touch about is Ukraine's aspirations for NATO membership. Obviously, we can't discuss it every week, but I think this question from Kieran could be a useful refresher for us.
Hi, Ukrainecast. This is Kieran in Tokyo. I'd like to ask about the general acceptance of Putin's condition that Ukraine does not join NATO, since he does not want any NATO countries bordering Russia. Isn't it an admission by Putin that he will continue taking bites out of Ukraine and other countries? Should this not be called out in discussions with him? I find it strange that this condition is treated as acceptable when it just leaves the door open to future attacks.
Vitaly, you've touched on this already, but the question of why it's not being called out.
Well, to start with, there are 4 NATO member states right on Russia's border already, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania and Finland. Listen, I do think it's been a red herring all along. It's never been about Ukraine joining NATO. It has been about capturing Ukrainian territory and controlling Ukraine as a state, social, political spheres, all of it. So when Putin raises the prospect of NATO expanding, well, there's a reason why countries are asking to join NATO, and so many have, and it's because of Russia's expansionism. Ukraine has been told repeatedly, year after year, that no, you're not joining us. But the fact is, NATO membership has worked for other countries in Russia's vicinity. Why not Ukraine?
Just a reminder, we are recording this on Thursday, and we are just hearing that the Foreign Office, the UK Foreign Office, has summoned the Russian ambassador over the latest strikes in Kyiv. I wonder what you make of that, James.
I mean, why now is the question. I suspect it's because of the diplomatic backdrop. Because if the British embassy, if the UK is suddenly exercised by this Russian strike, then why not the countless other Russian strikes that rain down on Ukrainian cities? You suspect that it doesn't want these diplomatic efforts to be derailed, albeit that the tracks we're on are in a circle. We're not going anywhere. At the moment, as far as Europe's concerned, it's got Trump using words like American involvement in security guarantees. He is listening to them. They have his ear. And so if it takes a tough stance against Moscow, airstrikes like this that completely contradicts the applause that Putin was met with by Donald Trump in Alaska, then it will want to talk that up and present it to Washington as something serious, and that's something that should be countered in some way.
And I guess we have the British Council building this time being damaged.
Yeah, and that's unusual. I mean, it's unusual for such buildings in central areas of Kyiv to be damaged in this way, which I think is reflective of the typical Russian blend of drones and missiles all at once to overwhelm air defences. And of course, we've seen, according to officials in the city, 2 ballistic missiles slam into a residential block. Make of that what you will.
Of course, Donald Trump hosted that meeting in the White House just after the Alaska summit. And it was interesting. Finland was there, one of those bordering countries to Russia that's now a member of NATO. But interestingly, a major European country that borders Ukraine and has been incredibly important in the logistics and in the support for Ukraine since the war began was not there, and that's Poland. And Margaret has been in touch with the following question.
Hi, Ukrainecast. Margaret in East of England here. I would just like to ask about Poland. Firstly, how come it wasn't represented at the White House summit last week? And secondly, is there a real concern about whether Russia could attack Poland? And what would happen if it did? Thanks.
Well, Poland, of course, is in an interesting political situation now. It has in Donald Tusk a prime minister who is far more EU friendly, has been friendly towards Ukraine, but a new president, of course, who does not come from the same political stable as him, President Nawrocki, and these internal tensions in countries have a way of playing out on the international diplomatic stage, don't they? I wonder what you made, I don't know who takes this on, the significance of Poland not being there and where it stands at the moment.
Well, I think it's an excellent question from Margaret. The answer to that is, I don't know. I've asked people in Warsaw. They don't really know either. I've had a look at an article on the BBC website about why Poland wasn't there. I don't think I understand why it wasn't still. The reason why the Polish president, Alexander Stubb, was there was possibly because the Finnish president was there was possibly because he plays golf and he can speak to Trump and Trump will listen. So the people who came there were, possibly the people who Trump was more inclined to listen to. But Poland is a very notable mission. And what I've been told by people who are in Warsaw is that they can detect a shift in attitudes towards Ukrainians, in that Ukrainians don't feel as welcome anymore. And the president, Karol Nawrocki, recently vetoed a bill on payments to Ukrainian refugees, social security payments to Ukrainian refugees.
1 million since the war began.
Yeah. And now Polish payments for Starlink communication systems used by Ukraine, they're also under threat. So to some, it feels like Poland's kind of stepping slightly further away from helping Ukraine. Will it be attacked by Russia? Well, if the Western response continues to be so weak, that is basically an invitation to attack. Because what will the West do? Who knows? Maybe.
It's interesting because there has traditionally been total agreement across the political sphere in Poland, that Russia is a threat. That's never been doubted. You had the Nationalist Law and Justice Party, of course, the two brothers who have been the Kaczynski brothers, who have really been the power either in place or behind the throne. One of them, of course, died in a plane crash, which, in Poland at least, they sort of have blamed Russia for. So it's interesting to see the development.
Yeah, when I was in Washington, I got to speak to Maciek, a correspondent from Polish TVN, and he also said that things are shifting in Poland when it comes to Ukraine.
Well, actually, on a kind of slight flip side of it, Poland was famously not present in the White House, but where it features really prominently is in Russian influence operations, because we see fake videos produced by a variety of Russian kind of covert influence operations on social media on a regular basis. Like, it is one of the big targets, Poland. And what we often see and have seen over the past at least a year or so, if not more, attempts to portray Ukrainian refugees in Poland as being kind of unruly and barbaric or scammers and people like doing some dodgy things and that they really need to be expelled. And I think it might not be as prominent in the White House, but it clearly is like the eyes of the Russian media operation are clearly on Poland as one of the big targets.
So they're working, those operations, by the sound of it, possibly.
I think you can be both wary of Russia's threat and become increasingly disassociated with what Ukraine's fate. And I suspect that might be what's going on in Poland with the passing of time.
Interesting. Plenty of food for thought there. Thanks to Margaret for that question, and to Tad in Texas, who wrote in with a similar one as well. Now, last week we discussed how President Zelensky's long-term leadership is viewed in Ukraine amid continuing Russian attempts to question his legitimacy. And today, well, the boot is on the other foot because Bruce in Alaska asks, is Putin legitimate? Putin challenges Zelensky's legitimacy, arguing that elections haven't been held, ignoring the Ukrainian constitution. But the Russian constitution limits the president to 2 terms in a row. Medvedev filled in the 1-term gap between Putin's second and third terms. Putin changed the constitution from 4-year to 6-year terms, but did not remove the 2-term limit, as I read it. Putin is now in his 5th term with no gap between either his 3rd and 4th or 4th and 5th terms in office. He appears to be in violation of the Russian constitution.
Well, all we know is that he's been in charge of Russia since the year 2000, basically. He is a stickler for protocol and rules, and he normally tries and makes sure that, there are different paragraphs and articles in place to justify whatever he's doing. But what's important is that he's in charge. He is the one. And Medvedev, he was chosen because he was safe. Everybody else is still there in the Russian political elite. They're there because they don't really pose a threat to Vladimir Putin. The moment you do mount a challenge, well, you are under threat yourself, which is what happened to Yevgeny Prigozhin, who led that mutiny, and then he got killed in a plane crash. So Vladimir Putin, he's made sure that he's the only one.
But also, let's not forget that the majority of the Russian population, it still supports Vladimir Putin. And also, I mean, if you talk to some of the pro-Kremlin types, they would just say, well, he's our president, we support him, it doesn't matter. They don't even talk about how long he's been in power. They don't really mind. And when it comes to the Russian opposition, obviously they've been saying that he has not been legitimate for years now, ever since he swapped with Medvedev in 2011. But that's a tiny minority, vocal, but tiny minority.
What about, I suppose, the meat of this question from Bruce about the Russian constitution? What does it actually say now?
Well, the thing is, they've nullified they've changed the constitution, and they've nullified the terms, Putin's terms. So it was called
starting from scratch.
So he started from scratch. So technically, he is legitimate, but things have been done to make it look
a reset,
like
as one former US administration talks about. But the clock has been reset.
Effectively, yeah.
Right, and just a thought, Bruce from Alaska. You didn't bump into him. Did you meet him?
Maybe, but I didn't recognise him. So next time we're both in Alaska.
I'm pretty sure he would have recognised you.
Make yourself, known to me.
Next time you're in Alaska, exactly.
Yeah,
exactly.
When's that going to be?
Whenever that is. Well, we're going to turn to another country, another big international power, and what its role in all this might be. Because we heard this week that Vladimir Putin will be among those who will be going to China's Victory Day parade next Wednesday. And that means his relationship with President Xi is once again under the microscope. And that's something that has inspired this question.
Hello, it's Kevin Hall from Boston in Lincolnshire. Is it true that President Xi took tactical nuclear weapons off the table for the Russians at the beginning of the full-scale invasion? Do we consider, now as we are at this critical point in the peace negotiations, whether Putin would actually use one, they have them in their arsenal, to gain further advantage in his peace dealings?
James, I'm sure someone who's been living in Kyiv, you have reflected on the possible use of tactical nuclear weapons. Thoughts on President Xi and what he may or may not have said to President Putin?
Yeah, I mean, I remember, Kevin, when Vladimir Putin was especially rattling the nuclear sabre, wasn't he, in 2022, threatening to use a so-called tactical nuke, which would wipe out a small city. There were reports of one being deployed in the east. And I remember we had to relocate from Kyiv, Zelensky's home city in the south. We had to push further west just as a precaution. And that by then we had started packing radioactive suits, which was interesting. And now if you stay in a hotel in Ukraine, it's not uncommon to have one laid on for you in the wardrobe. But I remember equally, later in 2022, Beijing unusually spoke out. Of course, it's very reluctant to condemn the war, but it spoke out saying, look, we don't see it as helpful that a nuclear power would make such threats in this way.
There was a lot of signalling going on there, wasn't there? I think the Biden administration's top officials, they were picking up the phone to their Russian counterparts and letting it be known.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think this is the standoff we found ourselves in all along. I mean, the question mark over nuclear weapons, of course we take it seriously. I think the relative chance of them being deployed are still slim because of the costs, not least with an attack like this, but also what it would mean for the Kremlin. Because the West, you would suspect, would have to escalate in some way. But the theme of nuclear weapons and who has them and whether they'll use them has run throughout this war. It is why you don't see Western boots on the ground in Ukraine, and is why we have seen the West have to grow in so much confidence to give the military aid that it does today. But it is still why Vladimir Putin felt able to wage this war in the first place.
Xi Jinping is one of the very few people who Vladimir Putin has very good reason to listen to. I'm not sure about Donald Trump, but Xi Jinping definitely, because China is buying almost half of Russia's crude oil exports. India, 38%. So when China says something, Vladimir Putin listens. And also, let's not forget about all the parts that are being imported to Russia from China that Russia is using in its defense industry, and various ways of circumventing financial sanctions as well. China's been helping with those too.
What about a Chinese role in negotiations? We haven't heard anything. And at the beginning of the war, they were very involved, weren't they, in putting across their own plan and trying to insert themselves into some kind of
we say plan. It was more like a very vague vision, wasn't it?
We'll call it a vision, yeah.
Yeah. Well, China is not exactly an independent mediator. They've got a lot of skin in the game, for which reason Ukraine says, no, we don't want Chinese peacekeeping or mediation or whatever. But look, if China was interested in making this stop or somehow reining Putin in, they could easily do that by just stopping buying the oil.
Great. Well, look, thanks all of you. Just before we go, we are doing some research to find out how you can improve the podcast. And if you want to have your say, just enter bit.ly/Ukrainecast feedback into your browser. And to make it even easier, we'll also drop a link in the description. We'll be back with a new Q&A episode next week. But in the meantime, why not subscribe to Ukrainecast wherever you get your BBC podcast for plenty of extra analysis. Thanks very much for watching. Bye for now.
Ukrainecast from BBC News.